Welcome to this edition of Fraud Talk, the ACFE Fraud Podcast. I'm John Gill, Chief Training Officer for the ACFE. And so my guest today is Gary Weiss. And Gary has a new book that came out in late August, early September of 2022 called Retail Gangster, the insane real-life story of Crazy Eddie. I buy a lot of books from Amazon. We have a fraud library here in Austin, Texas at the ACFE's headquarters. And so I have alerts from everywhere looking for books on fraud, especially new ones. So when this popped up, I was excited. I pre-ordered it. And when I got my copy, I was really excited to go through it and also enjoyed the pictures in here. There's some great ones that Gary has. And so actually on the day I got it, I was reading through it and I thought, this is a great book. I am enjoying this. So I reached out to Gary. He had his website listed in the book, contacted him and said, I'm having a ball reading this. Would you be interested in doing a podcast with me about it? And he kindly wrote back that very day and said that he would. So Crazy Eddie, if you have not heard of him before, very quickly, it will obviously talk about him a lot more as we go through this, but I'm familiar with Crazy Eddie because one of our early self-study courses, and this was back when the format was a 50-minute video and then a workbook on various topics. We did one on how to detect and prevent financial statement fraud. And the featured case in that video and workbook was Crazy Eddie Antar. We had done an interview with his cousin, Sam E., initial E. Antar, and everybody called him Sammy for obvious reasons. And so our founder, Dr. Joseph T. Wells, he did a video interview with him. We made that part of the video on the Crazy Eddie story, and it was extremely fascinating. And then later, Dr. Wells wrote a book called Frankenstein's of Fraud. It had some of the best fraud cases of the 20th century, and Crazy Eddie's was one of those cases. And so that's how I was familiar with the case. Always found it to be one of my favorites. It was he committed fraud through the 70s and 80s and eventually, went to justice in the 90s. And a lot of people, say of a younger bent, look at some of these older cases like, well, that case is too old to be relevant. But I argue you would be wrong on that. I think understanding the history of fraud is important in understanding what goes on today. As Joe Wells has said before, it's variations on a theme. And if you can go back and you can study these early frauds, it's still the same types of things occurring, and there's still a lot of lessons to be learned. And if nothing else, it's just important to kind of understand the history. And there are a lot of regulations, there are a lot of laws, there are a lot of changes in the way things are done that are the result of these cases. And so I think it's important, if you're serious about being a fraud examiner, detecting and preventing fraud, to be familiar with these really historic cases, because they really did change the profession as we know it. So that's my introduction. Well, to introduce Gary and let him, he's the guest, and let him speak. So talking about the fact that it was an older case, I know later in the book you talk about you also hooked up with Sam E. Antar and talked to him because he responded to a blog post that you had. Is that what gave you the idea for doing this book? Where did the idea come from?
Well, as you say, well, first, I want to thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. This is one of the great fraud podcasts, and you guys know about fraud, and you're going to be able to really hold me to account on this. But Sam contacted me because I had written about a particular CEO, a guy named Patrick Byrne, and his hijinks and his shenanigans, and he was harassing everybody who didn't like his company. It became pretty notorious for that. Nowadays, he's known mainly for these election conspiracy theories, but back then he was known mainly for his management, so to speak, of Overstock.com. So anyway, he reached out to me and he put out a comment on my blog, a blog that I was doing at the time, which didn't quite go through for technical reasons. So anyway, I used his comment as a blog post. And he was sort of sarcastic. He was attacking Patrick Byrne. And then I got to know Sam, and I got to know the Crazy Eddie fraud. I met him. I talked to him. I was vaguely, I grew up in New York, and I was familiar with Crazy Eddie, but I was not really that intimately aware of Crazy Eddie. But I got to know Sam, and I got to, look through his writings on fraud. And particularly on accounting fraud, I learned a great deal about it. And I got to know the Crazy Eddie story. Now, that was a long time ago. That was about 15 years ago. And over the years, I got to think about doing a book. But, I was hampered by the fact that, boy, it was one hell of a story. It was like a big story. It wasn't just a fraud story. It was also a story of a successful company that engaged in a successful marketing. And also there was the cultural aspect. My God, I mean, this company was all over the Eastern Seaboard. It had a national reputation for its salesmanship, mainly because of the guy who was the front man for Crazy Eddie, who was not Eddie, but a fellow named Jerry Carroll, who did the commercials. Our prices are insane. It became well known everywhere. So it was such a big and unwieldy story. It was like writing about an octopus, with various tentacles. So it took a while. I did a couple other books in the interim, and it took me a while to get my hands around it. And I finally did 2 years ago. And this book is the result of that. Hell of a story. Most difficult story I've ever had to deal with, though. I don't mean to complain, but that was my observation. But I think it was worth it.
There's a lot to unpack as you're going through it. And I was most familiar because we had focused primarily on the financial statement part of it in our teachings. I was very interested to learn that they were engaging in fraud from the very start. And that was something that I had not been that familiar with. And again, like Gary said, even if you go on YouTube and put in Crazy Eddie commercials, there's several commercials on there. And if you've never seen one, it is worth doing that. That was their claim in fame. And you document the history of that, but it was brilliant. People love to hate the Crazy Eddie commercials, and they would come on with Jerry Carroll, who was the spokesperson, screaming, we will not be undersold. Our prices are insane. And it became a cultural phenomenon. And people loved it. And they would come in and they would buy consumer electronics. But from the start, they were engaging in some of your typical schemes of bait and switch, where people would come in and they would see the ad for one product and they would try and talk them out of that and to get a product where they beta more on the product margins, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, pretty much the entire operation was permeated with fraud, which is not to say that everybody who worked there was a fraudster. That's absolutely not true. I mean, the marketing people were pretty much clean. I'd say the salesmen, although they engaged in practices, they were a little questionable. I mean, they were basically legitimate. I mean, they were selling legitimate product. But if just a little bit under the surface from the very beginning, there was fraud. I mean, for example, the logo of Crazy Eddie that he started using sometime in the late 70s was this crazy looking guy, and it was all over the place. It was on his stock certificates. It was in his commercials. It was on his business cards. It was everything. It was iconic. It was this guy. It was like an image, a logo, I guess, a trademark, a service mark of a crazy man. Okay, well, he stole that. Eddie stole that from a cartoonist named Robert Crumb, Art Crumb, who was well known in the '60s for his famous cartoon Fritz the Cat. It became a movie, and he did cartoons. But he stole that from Crumb, and Crumb didn't know it. Crumb knew about it, but Crumb didn't give permission for him to. You can't just steal a logo. I can't steal your logo or whatever. He just stole the logo and didn't pay him a penny, didn't ask him. And it was that kind of thing throughout. Eddie stole from everybody he came into contact with. The closer you were to Eddie, the more likely it was that he was going to cheat you or steal from you. Some guy, there's a little anecdote I have in the book about this guy named Newman, Gerald Newman, who carried out consulting work for Eddie to make him go public. He carried out consulting work for Eddie. He had a handshake agreement. Big mistake. You don't have a handshake agreement with Eddie Antar. No. So they had a handshake agreement. Eddie didn't pay him a penny, and he sued. Newman sued, lost, because there's this thing in the law, they call it the statute of frauds. You're over a certain amount of money, it's got to be committed into writing. And, on the basis of that, it was thrown out. He didn't pay him a penny. He sued. He appealed. He lost. And this is an example of the way Eddie treated people, and ultimately it led to his downfall. But he was engaged in all manner of fraud. I get into the warranty fraud. There were frauds over the warranties. There was fraud, phony warranty claims were a moneymaker for Eddie. Insurance fraud was a moneymaker. He called it spiking the claim. And as you mentioned earlier, there was blatant bait and switch. People come in for one kind of product and they walk away with another product. Eddie advertised that he have all the big names, Sony, Panasonic, Bose, blah, 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 blah. He advertised that, but when you get into his store, you find that he wasn't that anxious to sell you a Sony. Now, you'd think that he'd want to sell you a high-priced Sony, but no. The Sonys didn't give him much of a profit margin, so he'd switch you to a Sharp and look, hey, he wants you to save money. He wants you to go to a cheaper product. But what he didn't tell you was that the Sharp or the lower-priced product gave him a higher profit margin. And that's bait and switch, but it didn't smell like bait and switch to the customer because he wants you to go to a lower price margin. He was everything, and of course he stole from his wife. He cheated his wife. He treated his wife abysmally. Everybody.
Yeah, we'll get into that. That was an interesting story, but you do explain how he could have such insanely low prices. One of the ways he collected the sales tax, but he didn't forward it on to the taxing authorities.
Oh, sure. Yes. And that gave him a really sort of a built-in it gave him some wiggle room there in setting his prices. So, because he was collecting taxes, but not turning them into the government, he was able to undercut his competitors if they weren't engaged in that exact same practice, and most of them weren't. So he was able from the beginning to sometimes sell even under cost, because he was taking them, and therefore he was able to have these big advertised specials in which he didn't. In which he was able to sell for under cost because of the fact that he collected the sales tax, which I think at the time was 7%, and this sort of gave him an automatic profit margin.
Oh, I've got a quote I'd like to read. The insurance fraud was also interesting to me because some of these were older buildings, and yes, they had not unexpectedly a pipe would break or the roof would leak and there would be water damage. And so what was funny to me is as soon as, let's say the basement filled with water, they were bringing boxes of full of products from other stores and dumping them down in the water so that they could claim the losses on their insurance. And I thought, yeah, there any way to game the system, they were open for it. But that was funny. It's like, well, they had if he had a water leak, why not take advantage of that? Let's get some of this merchandise that we can't sell. We'll put it down. And there's like, well, if it wasn't enough water still left, they would get a hose out and they would hose it down. But here's a quote I like from the book. It says, Eddie had limits when it came to insurance fraud. He never started a fire in one of his stores, never faked a robbery, or sabotaged his own plumbing. Sammy remembered how furious Eddie was when he learned about a fire that occurred in one of the other stores. And it's like, he didn't torch the place. What got him mad was not that the plant burned down, but that his partner hadn't insured it for fire damage. They missed out on spiking the enhanced windfall. So it's like, well, if it had burned down, they could have claimed all this extra merchandise and gotten insurance proceeds, but they didn't take out any insurance coverage on it. But it was interesting to me that was his line. It's like, well, I'm not going to break the pipe on purpose. That would be wrong. But if the pipe happens to break, then he saw nothing wrong with throwing all the merchandise he could possibly fit in the basement down in the basement to collect on the coverage. So it's such an odd line to me that he seemed to take pride that I didn't commit insurance fraud really, because I didn't break the pipe. The pipe just happened to break. A few extra boxes fell in. So be it.
Yeah, they used to call it spiking the claim. You got a claim. Let's make the most of it. In fact, he used to keep waterlogged merchandise that he had previously submitted for claims. He used to keep them in a special warehouse, and then he trotted them out. So not only would he bring poor selling merchandise and dump it in the basement, if there was a flood or whatever, but he'd take merchandise that he previously had submitted for claims that were these moldy boxes, and he'd dump the moldy boxes in. And he had a crooked insurance adjuster working with him. You really need an insurance adjuster in those types of commercial claims. You get a crooked insurance adjuster who he paid under the table and who in turn paid the other guy under the table. He was never caught for that. In fact, what's remarkable about Eddie is that he wasn't caught for the majority of the crimes that he committed, not for the insurance fraud, which was blatant. The warranty claims were part of the initial, part of his initial criminal complaint. So it was but it was not big. He was never really caught up short for the warranty claims, and the sales tax fraud was really significant. It was a big money maker. And back in the 70s when he was doing this, he was starting to do this by the 70s and 80s. There was so much crime going on in New York City, of all kinds, that it just was part of the background noise of crime in New York at the time. And that's one of the reasons he was able to get away with it. That, and I think the fact that he didn't, as you point out, he didn't deliberately rob his own stores or create conditions. He just took advantage of them. And, he didn't go overboard with this insurance fraud, which I think was less a question of morality than one of perhaps sort of risk. He wasn't willing to take quite that amount of risk. If he had a legitimate broken pipe, perhaps he felt, again, I don't know the exact reason, but I assume that perhaps it was, in his case, I don't think it was morality. I don't believe he had any. I think it was risk on his part, probably.
Well, he was too afraid they could tell if he had broken the pipe himself, because then they're like, well, that's more serious. They, I guess, as part of doing business, they just assume, well, people are going to pad their claims or spike their claims, and that's just the cost of doing business, and we build that into the premiums. But if you go the extra step and burn your store down or try and break a pipe for fake water damage, then they take that more seriously, and it was more likely to involve the police. Or I think it's not a line of morality. It was more of, he thought, well, if I went that far, they would probably call the cops on me and I would get caught.
Yeah, well, particularly for something like arson, you have to hire an arsonist. And, might not, the fire inspectors, even in those days, were pretty serious fire inspectors. They were incorruptible, the fire inspectors in New York City. And I think they might have been able to find out that it was arson. True, there was widespread arson in the South Bronx at the time. Half the South Bronx was burned down and very few prosecutions. But perhaps he felt, look, I don't want to go that far. I don't want to have to hire an arsonist, bring people in who were not in the family to carry out these crimes. His feeling was that, he kept everything within the family and trusted subordinates. And that was his strategy for getting away with it. And he almost did get away with it, really.
Real quick on the warranty fraud, just for people who are listening, there were several things. The one that I remember the most that you had highlighted was the fact that somebody would bring in a VCR. It was out of warranty, and they say, "Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about it. It's out of warranty." But they would take it, and then they would fake the documentation to show, change the sales date, and then they would submit it to the manufacturer for repairs or reimbursement, and they would just keep that. So the customer was, out of luck, but they got reimbursement for warranty claims that they kept.
Sure. And also they would put in for work that was not done, even in legitimate. They would spike their warranty claims. So, one of the people involved in warranty fraud, the head of warranty fraud for a time at Crazy Eddie, the majority of the claims that he put in were phony claims. So it was a big thing at Crazy Eddie, big thing.
So they were making a lot of money through all these schemes, and they kept opening stores. And one thing that they were doing, which comes into play later, is they were skimming a lot of that money and they were moving it overseas. And they called it the NECTI. The NECTI.
Yeah, it's cash skim. Yeah,
right.
NECTI. Yeah,
and most of it was going to overseas banks. A particular bank in Israel, correct? And
right.
I forgot the amount at one point. I think it got up to about 50 million, 53 million or something that was over there. Or I may be wrong on the number, but they were moving a lot of money overseas so they wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. But what was interesting is when they then got to a point where now they needed money because they had bled so much out of the company that somebody said, well, if you just go public and have an initial public offering, an IPO, well, you could make lots of money. And so they thought that sounded like a great idea. But then when they started, in Sam Antar that we've been talking about, he was the CFO of the company. He went and got an accounting degree and took the CPA exam because Eddie had asked him to. It was a very family-run business.
Yeah, he worked for Crazy Eddie's auditors, as a matter of fact. They're early auditors for his accounting training. But the NECTI was really that was really interesting. They were skimming the money like a lot of merchants do. Look, skimming money, putting it in a safe deposit box. So they put it in. They used to hide it originally in the ceiling panels of their houses and in radiators and in mattresses and other traditional hiding places for cash. Over time, they started sending it to accounts in Israel. They liked Israel. They enjoyed traveling there, so they take a little trip to Israel and deposit it at Bank Leumi in Tel Aviv. Before they went public, Sammy, their young nerdy accounting maven, he said to them, "Look, we got all this money overseas, and you're saving in taxes, but look, you can use this money, but you're saving in taxes, but you're shooting yourself in the foot because all the money that you're taking out is reducing your profits. Now, look, if you want to go public, this was the 80s when the IPO craze was just heating up. He said, look, if you want to go public, what you want to do is you want to make it seem if you've got increasing profits. So what I suggest you do is take this money that we got sitting out there in Israel and start. Well, and what you want to do is, you want to reduce the amount of money that you take out of the company and reduce it in such a way to make it seem that, whoa, our profits are really increasing because they're taking less and less money out of the company. And it worked because you looked at these balance sheets, you look at these operating statements in the prospectus, and whoa, it was really good. This was a great company. If they had not done that, if they were not manipulating their cash take out of the company, they would have had a fairly mediocre record of sales and profit increases. It wouldn't have looked that great if they hadn't been doing this. And I'm not sure they would have been able to go public at all. Or if they had been able to go public, it probably would have been with some schlocky penny stock outfit and not with Oppenheimer and Company, which was a very prestigious, which was, and I guess still is, to the extent that it still exists. It was a very prestigious investment bank. So then they had all this money, but nevertheless, they were taking less out of the company, but they still had a lot of money in Israel and in other places, and they began over time. They found a use for that too.
It was, I thought that was so odd that they had to stop in order to go public. They had to stop stealing so much so that it would actually look profitable, because it was getting so, they'd taken so much. If you looked at it, the company didn't look very good at all. But when you saw the actual sales, it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't too bad. So they had to slowly. I remember they had a very pretty good plan on that, because they couldn't just stop all at once, because like, well, wait, 1 quarter the sales are minimal, and now all of a sudden they're they're so high and they're bringing so much revenue. So they had to slowly do this so that it wouldn't look so odd, and it would look like, well, they were just making money each month or each quarter. So they finally got to a point where they decided that the books looked good enough that they might pass muster if somebody looked at them. And so that's when they started looking at Oppenheimer, and they had some really first-class people involved with this, law firms, and the underwriter Oppenheimer, and they had a big eight at the time, or big whatever. They had a well-known, I guess, the forerunner of KMG Maine was the audit firm. And so what really surprised me is that with this talent that was looking at their information, trying to decide if they were going to sponsor this public offering, how did they miss all of this? It's
well, you know what it is, really. It's the assumption that people make, and it's usually a valid assumption, that when they're dealing with a company, that the company may be cutting corners, may not be 100% truthful, but isn't just out and out crooks. Now, this is the same assumption, and it's usually a valid assumption. I mean, if you assume that everybody you deal with might be a complete crook, well, then that's kind of paranoid, wait a second, that looks to me, their profits doing well. They obviously are a Ponzi scheme. No. In most cases, 90% of the time, you're dealing with CEOs who are basically honest. Basically honest. They aren't, or at least not felons. They're not going to go to prison someday. Madoff benefited from that generally correct assumption, and so did Antar before him. You assume that the person that you're dealing with, that the people you're dealing with are not dishonest. And look, at the time, Eddie's company fell into a certain category of company that was very fashionable at the time. Like there was, for instance, Manny, Mo, and Jack, the auto parts chain that was very popular, and it was viewed as a like a real working man's. it was viewed as a company that was a little rough around the edges, just like Minnie Mo and Jack and some of these other working class type companies. A little rough around the edges, but basically profitable companies. So they benefited from that, and the auditors coming by. These were the guys who did the due diligence. They were Ivy Leaguers. They weren't acquainted with these Brooklyn Brooklyn guys, and they were charmed and suckered by these guys, and they never assumed, look, these guys are just complete felons. They're lying to me. They never assumed that. And look, if I was one of those auditors, I don't think I'd have necessarily assumed that the profits were ginned up by manipulation of cash skim. I don't think I would have assumed that, and most people wouldn't.
And that's a good point. And one of the tenets of our profession, especially in the audit profession that we try and teach, is this idea of professional skepticism.
Oh yeah,
that you're right. I mean, your first, for an ordinary human being, your first reaction is to trust people.
yeah.
And you don't assume that if they hand you a set of financials that everything on here is fraudulent. You think, well, they probably inflated inventory slightly, or maybe they played fast and loose with timing of the sales, but you don't go into it thinking everything on this sheet is somehow manufactured, which in Crazy Eddie's case, that actually was the case. I mean, virtually every line item on that financial statement was fraudulent. All of those numbers were incorrect. So it one of the lessons that I take from Crazy Eddie, and also I did a interview recently with a guy named Barry Minko, who was the best fraud. He was in his teens. He started carpet cleaning business. He went public, and it was the same thing. It was all of the numbers were fraudulent, but no one looking at it thought, put it this way, everyone thought no one would do that.
Oh, sure.
It was just the blatantness of it, I think, caught everybody off guard, because no one does that. No one would be brave enough or stupid enough to just fraudulently inflate everything on their statements. And I love some of the inventory stories, because obviously that's a large part of their worth, is all the electronic equipment that they had. And so there were I remember some stories from the interview that we did with Sammy about, they're counting one warehouse. They'd find out where they were going, where did they want to go tomorrow, and then overnight they would just take all the merchandise from warehouse one, move it to the second warehouse,
Sure.
and count it all over again. And you tell a story about they had auditors on site counting the merchandise, and they had all their notes and papers, and they would lock them up when they went home, and they noticed they hid the key in a box of paper clips. And so they would go in and take the key, unlock, see what the auditors had counted, and again, then start moving the merchandise around so that they would count it a second time. And so it was.
Well, the amount of the fraud was really quite extraordinary. I mean, and for instance, as we were talking about the decrease in the NECD and how that inflated the fraud. I was just looking, between 1981 and 1982, profits increased 2%. Now, that would really not have gotten them a very good IPO. They inflated that number to 48% by manipulating the NECD. And obviously, I think the majority, I think the majority of people are looking at this 48% number say, well, maybe the real number is 40%, but not 2%.
Right. Well, and another lesson here is, I think for people when they're doing fraud awareness training, there were people who participated in this but had no fraudulent motive whatsoever. And there were numerous stories about where he would call up one of his suppliers and say, hey, we need the merchandise now, but can you wait and bill us next month? And they would do it like, okay, we'd do that as a friend, not realizing that that was going towards committing the financial statement fraud. There were people within the company that had worked there a long time, and it was kind of a family atmosphere. And Eddie would say, well, we just need to kind of bump up these numbers. Can you pad this a little bit? And they would do it because Eddie had asked them to do it.
Loyalty. And they didn't necessarily understand that increasing the value of the inventories would increase their profits. This is not a terribly esoteric accounting principle, but lay people don't necessarily understand that. And that's why, that's one of the reasons he was able to get away with it. I describe how there were two warehouse managers, both named Dave. There's the honest Dave that I describe and the dishonest Dave. The dishonest Dave was involved in some other scam that they were involved in. In fact, I believe he was the one who was involved in the warranty fraud. The dishonest Dave, he participated in this fraud, not knowing why the inflating the warehouses, not knowing exactly why. And the honest Dave, for pretty much the same reason. He was asked, he was loyal, but they both probably didn't entirely understand, well, why did Eddie want me to inflate these inventories? What is there about having it's better to have more stuff in your warehouse than less, but why did he want me to do this? And of course, Eddie was desperate to increase his profits, because after, he went public, and after the fraud started to grow and grow, it came obvious to him and obvious to everybody, that you really need to commit more and more fraud as you go on, because otherwise everything will just collapse. It's a little bit like a Ponzi scheme to that extent. In order, you just can't just let bygones be bygones if you're a public company, because people will notice if you stop committing fraud, then everything just sort of collapses, as eventually it did.
Well, and I didn't mark, but somewhere you had a line like, fraud is a beast that has to continually be fed. And that was the problem that they had, was that you can't just stop. You have to, in fact, on the back end, as it was going down, they were thinking, well, we need to go private and buy back the stock, because that's the only way they could see to get out from under this. And then that led to all types of other problems, because there were other family members that owned stock that didn't want to get involved with this. And then the Wall Street was getting rumors that he was selling stock, because then he was getting paranoid, and it really did spiral out of control there at the end. And you mentioned his wife. That was something that actually that stuck with me. It wasn't just defrauding the investors, defrauding the state, defrauding insurance companies. He really pulled a number on his first wife, to the point where I thought that was one of the worst things the man did. Basically, he had both his wife and his girlfriend were named Debbie. I thought it was interesting. You labeled Debbie 1, Debbie 2. Oh, yeah. And so he's living, off with Debbie 2, and Debbie 1 decides she doesn't want to have, not going to put up with this. She wants a divorce. And so he brings her all these papers, tells her to sign them, and tells her that, oh, well, this is just some preliminary papers. The judge will look through everything, and the judge will give you your fair share. But what she actually signed said that she got nothing.
All right. Yeah. He completely cheated her in the divorce and lied to her. And the closer you were, as I mentioned earlier, the closer you were to Eddie, the more likely it was you'd be completely swindled. And that's the way it was with his wife. The mother of his 5 daughters, and he promised her the moon in effect, and gave her basically nothing. Um, he had her sign a separation agreement, which in New York basically sets the terms of your divorce. And he said, "Well, this is just a it's just a." She claims never to have read it, and she probably didn't. You should go ahead and sign this, sign this, sign this. So she signed it, and she came away with nothing. She was fighting. She fought that in the courts. She won in the courts after it all collapsed. She was still fighting it through 2021, just a couple of years ago, just a year ago, because she never collected a penny, even though she won in the courts. She never collected a penny. He just never paid her. Another co-defendant never paid her. So she never collected
Well,
a penny.
and then as things did get really bad, he threw everybody else under the bus and tried to blame anything that was going wrong on the other family members. Sammy Antar's cousin was like, blamed him for everything. But then it did start to collapse. The FBI and the SEC both um, started looking more closely into it, and they both opened investigations, and it was becoming clear that the end was in sight. And so uh, Eddie, instead of facing the music, he decided he's going to cut and run. So um, what did Eddie do when the heat got turned up?
Well, as soon as he realized that things were turning sour here, the fraud was really increasing. It was spiraling out of control, and he couldn't get his hands over the fraud. He started putting his money. He put like all of his assets. He transferred. He already had assets in Israel, and he transferred all of his money to Israel. And then he became. And this is actually before he fled. He made some trips to Israel. He became a citizen of Israel. And then he got through nefarious means, he got phony passports, phony identities, and then he made one of his aliases a phony identity, a non-existent person with a phony Brazilian passport. He made one of his alter egos, his non-existent alter egos. He had that person, posing as that person. He became a citizen of Israel. He became a citizen of Israel under his real name, which was legitimate, and under a phony name, which is absolutely not legitimate at all. When the Israelis found out, and that was a big mistake, because when the Israelis found out, they were furious. Ordinarily the Israelis took a sort of a laissez-faire attitude. They were really not that anxious to turn over immigrants back to the countries of origin, even if they were criminals. And that was the problem when Meyer Lansky immigrated to Israel, the major racketeer from the 1930s. He emigrated to Israel in the 1970s, and Israel was loath to turn him over to the United States. Oh, they eventually did. He was an embarrassment. Well, Eddie had violated Israeli law in a big way, and they were anxious to get rid of him, and they did eventually. Eddie fought, but he was, after about a year, he had to go back to the United States and face the music.
And they did help track him down with the help of the American authorities, and found him and got him extradited. And
sure, he established accounts throughout the world, including one in Switzerland. He assumed incorrectly that the Swiss bank authorities would just like in the movies, that they would never turn over any information to the U.S. Far perish the thought. Well, that wasn't quite correct. Okay. So the Swiss authorities did cooperate. And as a result of Eddie making a serious but very common mistake among fugitives, he used his real birth date in in one of his phony accounts that he set up. He was discovered. His identity, his location in Israel was quickly ascertained, and then he was arrested.
And then he came back and they had a jury trial, and he was found guilty on all the counts. And you think, aha, that's justice is served. He's going to he got a pretty stiff sentence. I forgot exactly what it was, and you think, well, that would be the end of it. But no, they appealed the verdict, and amazingly, it was overturned on appeal. So after the appeal, he was set free because the judge had made some comments during sentencing that the defense argued made it sound like he had already made up his mind early in the trial that Eddie was guilty. I was a little surprised. I haven't read all the trial briefs, but just what you have here and what I remember, it was the comment. I would not have taken it that way. It was more that he was saying, well, the judge said that it was looking at the property and that he wanted, since Eddie was guilty, that from the start, he wanted to make sure that since Eddie was guilty, that the money would go to the victims and the people that deserved it. And so the appellate court took that to mean, oh, well, he'd already made up his mind before trial that he was guilty, so it was released. And so that was certainly a shock to people when that happened. But I think he realized that when he saw all of the evidence that the prosecutors had presented at trial, that it was not going to come out differently. He got, it was overturned based on a technicality, in effect. So he pleaded guilty the second time. Yeah. But he did get a little bit of a reduced sentence.
Well, he wound up spending 7 years in prison, which is, that's not a slap on the wrist.
Insignificant, but
it was significant. He pleaded guilty. He cut a deal with the prosecutors, and he got pleaded guilty to one count of racketeering, of RICO conspiracy. So he in effect admitted all the stuff that he'd been lying about. He was giving interviews before he was, while he was in prison in Israel, and after he was convicted, in which he told elaborate lies. But he finally, since he pleaded guilty, he finally admitted to the truth of the allegations that everybody had been making against him for years. And you have to admit, if he hadn't pleaded guilty, he would never have admitted to any of that stuff. And he did. And after he pleaded guilty, and after, he finally spent a period of time in prison, 7 years total from the time he was apprehended in 1992, he was released in 99. He never gave any interviews in which he claimed to be innocent. At that point, it was a little ridiculous. So he never did. Well, not that would have necessarily prevented him from making a stupid claim like that. But after that,
but it would have at least made you feel a little better if at some point he actually did feel some regret, some sorrow for what he did. But he went to his grave, I think, saying, I pleaded guilty, but I still don't think I did anything wrong. I mean, he never there was certainly no mea culpa at any point where he apologized. And again, like you said, he fought the lawsuit with his ex-wife, and he blamed all of the people like Sammy, the cousin who was the CFO, really did go above and beyond. I mean, in cooperating with the prosecutors, and the prosecutors and the FBI all gave statements at his sentencing hearing talking about he was extremely thorough, just tons of cooperation, which is rare. And he has, I think, really tried it. You always wonder why fraudsters want to talk about their frauds. And I think it's a combination. Some of them like to brag about what they did because they feel like, well, look how smart I was able to get away with this. But I do think that's a little bit with Sammy. However, there is, I think, a genuine, when he speaks to groups, he is really trying to say, look, I'm embarrassed and sorry for what I did. I'm trying to, through my presentations, warn people that this can happen under the right circumstances. And you do have to be skeptical. You do have to look at what's going on and just assume that everything could be fraudulent. Well, having spent 2 years, studying Crazy Eddie and his family and all the different frauds, having some time to let that kind of gel. And again, our audience, people who are looking for fraud within their organizations. They're looking for fraud in financial statements, at government filings. What are some of the lessons that you feel like you learned and that you could share with our audience about what you learned from working on the Crazy Eddie case?
Well, one of the lessons I learned, in terms of the character of the people of Eddie and of his co-conspirators, it's just an observation. I don't think it would help too much in terms of covering fraud, but Eddie was a very poor chess player, as the way I would describe it. He couldn't think 2 or 3 steps ahead. He was impulsive. For instance, going public turned out to be the worst mistake of their lives, because since they went public, it never dawned on them. But by going public, they were exposing them to being taken over. And if they were taken over, the fraud would be exposed. It was completely foreseeable, and that's exactly what happened. I would say that in terms of, looking at it from the professional standpoint, from the standpoint of the professional auditor or fraud examiner, as you say, you have to sometimes try to think the unthinkable. The unthinkable, you see this really amazing increase in profits. Like I say, it was 48% between 81 and 82. I believe it wasn't. It was actually 3%. You see these amazing, when you see amazing numbers, think the unthinkable. What could they have done to cause this? Now, I'm not saying that it was necessarily possible for people to uncover the skim that caused the 3% to go to 48%. But thinking the unthinkable might have put you a little bit closer to that answer. To have uncovered Eddie and his scams would have required really deep knowledge of his mindset and the way he thought. And that would only have been possible really if you got to know, well, not so much the culture, but if you got to know him and his family, and it would have required, and I'm not really sure necessarily that an investigation of Eddie would have necessarily uncovered much. He was a high school dropout. He worked in Times Square. He worked in some sleazy places, ripping off customers in Times Square. But how do you find that out? Generally speaking, the only way you find out something like that is through informants. So short of, and of course, there'd be no reason for an informant to come forward if you're an investigator, but getting to know the people as best you can, getting to know them not as friends, but as targets is what you really need if you find yourself confronted with numbers that are just too good to be true. And that was the tip-off, really, with Eddie. He had numbers that were too good to be true, 48%. And look at the industry as a whole. They weren't getting anywhere near that, 48%. It requires thinking the unthinkable and viewing your subject as a target. And, okay, maybe being a little paranoid. That's okay, because it was only the paranoid people who ultimately uncovered Madoff. Nobody uncovered Antar. I will say that the Barron's, in an article on the initial red herring, did a very, very good job. But they didn't write about fraud. They were just looking at what was disclosed in the red herring was really kind of strange, but it didn't really speak of fraud, it spoke of some very sort of strange stuff going on. For instance, they disclosed the existence of a medical school on the island of St. Lucia that wasn't really doing all that well. So there was a lot of smoke. There was no fire. It requires really examining, being not just almost skeptical, but adversarial. And even so, there's an excellent chance you're not going to find what you're looking for. But that's without being an adversarial, without being ultra skeptical, you will never be able to uncover fraud. You might as well just not even bother. The crazy Eddies will just slide right on by.
All right. Well, Gary, like I said, I appreciate your spending your time. Did enjoy the book. It had a great story, and I do think the lessons are relevant. And it's hard to believe all the things that they were able to do and get away with, and how long they were able to do it. And so they're just it's very fascinating.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it very much.
Well, good luck with the book, and I hope to have you back as a guest again another time.
I'd love to do it. Thanks again for talking.
All right. Thank you, and thanks to our listeners. Hope you've enjoyed this edition of Fraud Talk, the podcast for the ACFE. And again, this has been John Gill and Gary Weiss, and thank you very much for your time.